The ocean has a long memory. It remembers the thunder of guns, the rumble of engines, and the shadows of giants that once ruled its endless blue. In that memory lies a name often whispered by those who truly know naval history. A ship that fought not for glory, but because she had to. She was a fortress of steel, a predator in the night, and yet history barely speaks her name. She was the USS Washington, the most underrated American battleship of World War II. When people talk about the Pacific War, they talk about aircraft carriers. They speak of Midway, the Coral Sea, and the unstoppable rise of naval aviation. Battleships, they say, were relics, old kings dethroned by wings and engines. But in 1942, when the U.S. Navy was bloodied, desperate, and clinging to the edges of the Pacific, one battleship stepped out of the shadows and reminded the world what raw power and discipline could do. USS Washington was that ship. Born in the dark days before the war, Washington was the second of the North Carolina-class battleships. Her keel was laid down at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in 1938, a time when storm clouds were gathering across Europe and Asia. She was built not for show, but for survival. Designed under the Washington Naval Treaty, limits that demanded balance, firepower, speed, and armor, all within strict weight constraints. What emerged was one of the most beautifully engineered war machines ever to cut through the sea. 9 16-inch guns capable of hurling 2,700-pound shells over 20 miles, a wall of secondary batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and radar systems that made her a floating citadel. When she was commissioned in May 1941, the world was already aflame. Europe was under Nazi occupation. Britain was fighting for its life, and the Pacific simmered under the growing aggression of Imperial Japan. For the crew of the Washington, war was coming, and fast. Her first months were spent in the Atlantic, part of the American effort to guard convoys and deter German surface raiders. She sailed cold northern seas, escorting British ships and hunting for signs of the mighty Bismarck and Tirpitz. It was unglamorous work, days of gray skies, rough seas, and endless drills. But in those long months, the crew forged their skill. They learned precision gunnery, night operations, and the discipline of keeping a battleship alive in hostile waters. They were young, many barely out of high school, but under their officers, they became something formidable. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, everything changed. The old battleships that had been the pride of the U.S. Pacific fleet lay broken and burning in the harbor's oily waters. The age of the carrier had begun. Yes, but it was the battleships that had to hold the line until the carriers could recover. And among them, Washington was ready. In the spring of 1942, she was transferred to the Pacific. Her journey across the Panama Canal was like a rite of passage. Her sleek gray hull slid from the Atlantic into a different world, a world of coral reefs, tropical storms, and an enemy unlike any she had faced before. She joined the fast carrier task forces under Admiral Halsey, and her mission was clear: protect the carriers, engage the enemy, and hold the line. By mid-1942, the tide of war was uncertain. The U.S. had won at Midway, but the struggle for the Solomon Islands was turning into a brutal, grinding campaign. Guadalcanal became a word that bled meaning: jungle, disease, air raids, desperation. It was there, in the dark waters off Savo Island and Iron Bottom Sound, that Washington would carve her name into history. But before the thunder came the waiting. Weeks of escort duty, endless watches under the tropical sun, drills at dawn, gunnery practice at dusk. Every sailor aboard knew what was coming: a surface engagement against the Imperial Japanese Navy, whose night-fighting skills were legendary. American ships had already learned that lesson in blood. At Savo Island, a Japanese task force had ambushed the Allied fleet, sinking 4 cruisers in minutes. At Tassafaranga, another night battle left American ships in flames. The Japanese used superb optics, excellent torpedoes, and practiced coordination. The U.S. Navy was learning, painfully, how to fight back. Aboard Washington, training intensified. Her radar operators practiced until their eyes ached, learning to read the faintest blips on their cathode screens. Her gunners calibrated their fire control computers again and again. Her crew drilled damage control until it became instinct. Every man knew his station. Every second counted. Then came November 1942, the turning point. The Japanese Navy was determined to smash the American foothold on Guadalcanal. Their plan was simple: send battleships and cruisers to bombard Henderson Field, the airstrip that gave the U.S. control of the skies, and then land reinforcements. 2 great night battles would erupt in Iron Bottom Sound that month. The first, on November 13th, was a chaotic, close-range brawl that left both sides bloodied. 2 American light cruisers sunk, Admiral Callahan dead, but also 2 Japanese admirals gone. Yet the enemy wasn't finished. They sent another force south, two powerful battleships, the Kirishima and the fast battlecruiser escorts, with the same mission: destroy Henderson Field. To stop them, the Americans had one ace left, Task Force 64, under Admiral Willis A. Lee, and at the heart of that force was Washington. On the night of November 14, 1942, the sea was black and windless. Washington steamed beside her sister ship, the USS South Dakota, with 4 destroyers screening ahead. Radar picked up faint echoes, contacts moving fast, Japanese warships inbound. What followed would become one of the most remarkable naval duels in history, and the moment when USS Washington proved what an underrated battleship could do. But before the first shells flew, the destroyers paid the price of contact. The Japanese opened fire first. Torpedoes streaked across the water. Explosions lit the night, and in minutes, all 4 American destroyers were crippled or sinking. The sea boiled with flame and oil. The South Dakota followed Washington into the chaos, her radar picking up targets, cruisers, destroyers, a battleship. But the fight was confusion incarnate. Gun flashes blinded crews. Radio silence kept the ships guessing. One wrong turn could mean disaster. Washington's captain, Glenn B. Davis, and Admiral Lee on the bridge trusted their radar. It was a technology still in its infancy, but it was their advantage. While Japanese spotters relied on optics and the moonlight, Washington's men could see in the dark. And then, out there in the blackness, came the signal. Target identified. Enemy battleship. The Kirishima, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, was closing in. She was fast, heavily armed, and had already put several American ships under fire. But she was blind in the dark, unaware that she was walking straight into the crosshairs of the Washington. Admiral Lee gave the order. Washington's 9 16-inch guns trained and elevated. Her radar calculated range and bearing, 18,000 yards, closing fast. In the silence before the storm, the only sound was the low rumble of her engines. Then, fire. 9 brilliant flashes split the night. The recoil shook the sea itself. In the distance, giant orange blossoms erupted around Kirishima. Within minutes, Washington's gunners had found their range. Shell after shell smashed into the Japanese battleship. First the superstructure, then the turrets, then below the waterline. Kirishima tried to return fire, but she was blinded, burning, broken. In less than 10 minutes, she was mortally hit, her steering jammed, her crew fighting a losing battle to save her. She would roll and sink before dawn. Washington's radar-directed gunfire had been almost surgical. She had done what no battleship had ever done before, used radar to locate, track, and annihilate an enemy battleship at night without visual sighting. It was a revolution, and it came from a ship most Americans had never heard of. But even as Kirishima burned, danger loomed. Japanese cruisers and destroyers swarmed the area, launching torpedoes in all directions. South Dakota had suffered heavy damage, her power systems hit, her guns silent. Washington stood alone now, the last American capital ship still fully operational in those black waters. And yet she held her fire discipline, maneuvered calmly, and fought her way clear. When the sun rose over the Iron Bottom Sound, the sea was littered with wreckage, American and Japanese alike. But the enemy bombardment had failed. Henderson Field still stood. The Japanese never again tried to retake Guadalcanal. The battle, historians would later say, had been decided by a single ship's discipline and a single admiral's courage. USS Washington had turned the tide of a campaign, and yet, even then, she faded back into the mist. There were no grand headlines, no victory parades. She had done her duty. Nothing more, nothing less. In the logbooks of the Pacific, November 1942 marked a turning point. But for the men of the Washington, it was just another night survived. They had fought, won, and lived to see another dawn. The world, distracted by the glamour of carriers and the aerial battles that followed, never truly gave them their due. But the sea remembers. It remembers the thunder that rolled across some Iron Bottom Sound. It remembers the battleship that saw in the dark, struck without hesitation, and saved an entire campaign. It remembers the USS Washington, the quiet giant that changed history, one salvo at a time. The sea after Guadalcanal was different. The Japanese surface fleet had lost its sting, and the Americans had proven they could fight, even in the dark. But the war was far from over. For the men aboard the USS Washington, there was no rest, no celebration, no time to breathe in the glory they'd earned. After that violent November night in 1942, they sailed on into the endless Pacific, following a trail of smoke and orders. The battleship that had saved the fleet became its silent guardian. After the victory at Guadalcanal, the American Navy began to shift its momentum. The carriers were back in force, bringing the war to Japan's doorstep one island at a time. But those carriers needed protection, not from the air, but from what still lurked beneath and beyond the horizon. Submarines, surface raiders, the possibility of one last grand strike by Japan's battered fleet. These were the threats Washington was built to counter. She became the shield of the carriers, a silent shadow always nearby but rarely mentioned. When the sleek silhouettes of aircraft carriers steamed ahead, their decks bristling with planes, Washington was never far behind, her gray hull parting the Pacific like a blade. Her radar scanned the skies. Her guns stayed ready, day and night. Her crew kept to their drills as if every sunrise might bring another Guadalcanal. The men aboard her were hardened now. They had seen what the sea could do, what a single hit could mean. Yet there was pride too, quiet, unspoken pride in having faced the Imperial Navy and come out alive. Every sailor aboard, Washington, knew he was part of something that few outside their ranks could understand. By early 1943, Washington was operating as part of Task Force 58, the great carrier strike group that carried the war deeper into enemy waters. While carriers like Enterprise and Saratoga became famous names, Washington stood behind them, ready to take blows meant for others. She never complained. Battleships didn't. In February 1943, she joined operations in the South Pacific, covering convoys to the New Hebrides and the Solomons. The days blurred into one another. Gunnery drills, air raid alerts, long hours under tropical sun. But there was no glamour here. The war was moving away from surface duels and toward the skies, where aircraft ruled. Washington's job became one of patience and precision, an unseen hand that steadied the fleet. Her radar operators, once the heroes of Guadalcanal, now watched for different ghosts, not the shadows of enemy battleships, but the blips of incoming bombers. Japanese air attacks came in waves, sometimes at dawn, sometimes out of rain squalls that seemed to rise from nowhere. Washington's anti-aircraft gunners became some of the best in the fleet. They learned to aim by instinct, to read the angle of the dive, to lead targets at impossible speeds. Each gunner's world shrank to a sight, a trigger, and the burning sky ahead. In March 1943, the fleet turned its eyes north, to the Aleutian Islands, where Japanese forces still clung to frozen outposts. Washington was sent into those cold, fog-choked waters, a shocking contrast to the steaming tropics. The gray sea, the mist, the silence, it all reminded the crew of their Atlantic days before the war. But the mission was vital. The Aleutians had to be cleared before the Pacific offensive could truly begin. Washington's presence there was enough to deter any Japanese counterattack. Her guns never fired in anger during that campaign. But her role was clear. Her power alone was a message. The United States Navy was now everywhere. When 1944 dawned, the Pacific War entered its decisive phase. Island after island fell. Tarawa, the Marshalls, the Marianas. The Washington was always there, moving with the carrier groups, her wake a ribbon of resolve behind them. Her crew called her Washi, but there was nothing gentle about her when she spoke. During the invasions of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, Washington provided close cover for the carriers as they launched thousands of sorties. Her radar now guided not just her own guns, but also coordinated with nearby ships to form a defensive umbrella. When enemy aircraft broke through, her 5-inch and 40mm guns filled the sky with steel and fire. There are accounts from pilots who said flying near Washington during an attack felt like flying through a volcano. Tracer fire and flak bursting in every direction. But for all her service, the Washington's name was rarely written in headlines. The glory went to the carriers and their squadrons, to the raids that burned enemy airfields and crippled convoys. Washington's victories were quieter. No American carrier was lost while she stood watch. No enemy surface fleet dared approach her group again. Yet she still had her scars to earn. In February 1944, during nighttime maneuvers near the Marshalls, Washington collided with another U.S. battleship, the USS Indiana. It was a moment of horror. Two massive steel giants crossing paths in the dark. Pacific, their hulls grinding and tearing. Washington's bow crumpled inward, twisted steel and shattered compartments. For the crew, it was a reminder that even in friendly waters, death could come without warning. She limped back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The damage was serious, but not fatal. Her men took pride in the fact that, even wounded, Washington had remained afloat and steady. At the shipyard, her bow was replaced, her guns rechecked, and her systems upgraded. Within months, she was back at sea, as defiant as ever. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. fleet was larger, faster, and deadlier than ever. The Great Island battles were coming, the kind that would decide the fate of the Pacific. For Washington, this meant something new. No longer the desperate defender of Guadalcanal, she was now a veteran, a senior guardian among a growing family of ships. younger battleships joined the fleet. Sleek, powerful Iowa-class vessels with longer guns and faster speeds. Yet among them, Washington remained respected. She was the old fighter who had already proven herself in fire. As the fleet prepared for the assault on the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian and Guam, Washington once again stood in the line of battle. The Japanese would not give up those islands easily. They launched the largest carrier counterattack since Midway, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was there that Washington's anti-aircraft crews wrote another page of quiet heroism. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft came diving out of the sun, determined to strike the American carriers. Washington's guns spoke without pause. The air around her became a storm of fire. Sailors described the noise as deafening, the deck shaking from the constant bursts of the 5-inch batteries. Pilots flying above said they could see Washington's tracers from miles away, bright orange arcs slicing upward through the sky. By the time it ended, hundreds of enemy planes were downed. The Japanese Navy never recovered from the loss. But once again, the headlines didn't mention Washington. The press called it the Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot, and celebrated the carrier. Pilots who racked up kills. No one talked about the ships that made those victories possible. The battleships, whose gunners stood shoulder to shoulder for hours, keeping their carriers alive. Washington didn't need fame. Her crew knew what they had done. Their pride was in survival, in the silent discipline of their routines, in the confidence that when the storm came again, they would be ready. As the fleet moved westward, Washington's engines roared across seas she had never seen before. The names on the maps grew closer to Japan: Palau, Leyte, Luzon. Each campaign meant longer days, hotter sun, and fiercer skies. Each time the carriers launched their raids, Washington took her place beneath them, a wall of steel between the fleet and whatever came from the horizon. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, the men leaned on the rails and watched the sunset melt into the sea. They thought of home, of letters waiting back in the States, of mothers and wives and sweethearts. They thought of the friends they'd buried, the ones who hadn't made it past Guadalcanal. The ocean stretched out forever, and the war felt endless. But as long as Washington floated, they believed they would make it home. By late 1944, the tide of war was clearly turning. Japan's navy was shattered, its air power a shadow of what it had been. But the closer the Allies came to Japan, the more desperate the fighting became. Washington would soon find herself in the middle of one of the largest naval battles in history, a fight that would test her endurance, her crew, and the very idea of what a battleship was for. Her gunners cleaned their barrels. Her lookouts polished their optics. Her engineers fine-tuned every turbine and pump. She had already survived fire, darkness, and collision. Now she would face a storm unlike any before, a storm of steel, fire, and sky that would define the final chapter of her war. The USS Washington, the ship that once saved a fleet in the shadows, was about to join the greatest battle ever fought at sea. And once again, she would fight not for glory, but because it was her duty. Because even when history forgets the name, the sea never does. The Pacific in late 1944 was a graveyard of empires. The United States Navy had grown into a machine of overwhelming strength. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and battleships spread across the horizon like an iron tide. But though the Japanese fleet was dying, it was not yet dead. One final gamble remained, and the USS Washington would be there when that gamble unfolded, in the largest naval battle the world had ever seen. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. In October 1944, the Allies invaded the Philippines, seeking to cut Japan's access to oil and cripple its remaining forces. The Japanese High Command, desperate to stop them, threw everything they had left into the fight. 4 separate fleets moved toward Leyte from different directions, a desperate, complex trap meant to crush the American invasion forces. If it worked, it might turn back the clock. If it failed, Japan's navy would cease to exist. USS Washington was now part of the fast carrier task forces that formed the backbone of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. Her job was clear and familiar: protect the carriers at all costs. But the size of the coming battle was unlike anything she had faced before. The sea between the Philippines and Taiwan filled with ships, hundreds of them. The sky buzzed with planes. It was a clash of entire worlds, the culmination of every lesson learned since Pearl Harbor. And while much of the fighting in Leyte Gulf would be decided by air power, the battleships still mattered. They were the fleet's muscle, the guardians against any surface threat. On the morning of October 24th, Japanese carrier forces launched a massive airstrike. It was a desperate, chaotic assault, the last flicker of Japan's once mighty naval aviation. Washington's crew went to general quarters as enemy planes descended. Her gunners opened up with disciplined fury, tracking targets across the blinding sky. The air was thick with tracer fire. Explosions dotted the horizon. In that storm of metal and smoke, Washington's guns roared almost continuously for 2 hours. Dozens of planes went down in flames. Others broke off or were shot apart before they could strike. When the sky finally cleared, the American fleet still stood. But the battle was far from over. As night fell, reports came in that a Japanese surface fleet, including the massive battleship Yamato, was approaching from the north. The Americans braced for a confrontation that could have become a second Guadalcanal, only on a far greater scale. In the end, the Japanese plan collapsed under its own weight. Miscommunication, air attacks, and decisive American strikes shattered the enemy formations. The Yamato escaped that day, only to die months later. Washington's big guns stayed silent through the night, not for lack of readiness, but because the opportunity never came. The enemy never reached her, but her presence had mattered. Every Japanese admiral knew that if their ships closed within radar range of the Washington, the result would be the same as Hiroshima, annihilation. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The rest of the war would be a long, brutal road across island after island toward Japan itself. And through it all, Washington remained at her post, steady, loyal, unshaken. She steamed into 1945 as a veteran of every major Pacific campaign. Her crew had changed over the years. New faces replaced those who had gone home or never made it back. But the spirit aboard her remained the same. They were proud, though they rarely said it. They were professionals who had seen the war evolve from desperate defense to unstoppable advance, and they knew they were approaching the end of something monumental. As the Allies prepared to invade Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Washington's guns were needed again, not for dueling enemy battleships, but for bombarding shore defenses. For the first time, she used her 16-inch guns not against ships, but against fortifications carved into rock and coral. Each shell screamed across the water like a freight train, striking with such force that whole ridgelines seemed to vanish. Her gunners worked with precision, coordinating with spotter planes to adjust their aim. The men who fought on those islands would later say that the naval bombardments saved countless lives. Without ships like Washington pounding enemy defenses before the landings, the casualties would have been even worse. Washington was now the hammer of the invasion fleet, the old warrior lending her strength to the final push. At Okinawa, the war entered its most savage phase. Kamikaze attacks, suicide planes loaded with explosives, descended on the fleet in waves. No ship was safe, not even the battleships. Every sunrise brought new alarms, new screams over the intercom, new fireballs in the distance. Washington's anti-aircraft guns worked without pause. Her gunners became machines, their hands blistered, their shoulders bruised from the recoil. For weeks they slept in short bursts, ate at their stations, lived in the shadow of constant attack. And yet, Washington endured. She took near misses, fragments of burning planes, but she never faltered. Her radar tracked each threat. Her gunners answered with steel. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, she had helped shield the carriers and transports through one of the deadliest gauntlets of the war. By the summer of 1945, Japan was collapsing. Her cities were burning, her navy gone, her skies empty. Washington steamed closer to the Japanese homeland than any American. Battleship before her, preparing for what might have been the invasion of Kyushu, Operation Downfall. But before that invasion could begin, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was over. When the announcement came over the loudspeakers, there was no shouting aboard Washington, no wild celebration, just silence. Then a few scattered cheers, then tears. Some men dropped to their knees and prayed. Others stared out across the ocean, thinking of friends who hadn't lived to see this day. The old battleship had survived the storm. She had done everything asked of her and more. In the weeks that followed, Washington joined the occupation forces off Japan. Her great guns were quiet now. Her decks were scrubbed clean. The crew could finally breathe without the taste of cordite in their lungs. Some went ashore to see the ruins of a defeated empire. Others stayed aboard, unsure what peace would even feel like. When she finally sailed home, it was a journey unlike any before. No longer a warship charging toward battle, she was a veteran returning to a country that had changed. Crowds cheered as she entered port. Bands played. But even in victory, the world was moving on. The age of the battleship, the age she had defined, was ending. In the years after the war, Washington was placed in reserve, then finally struck from the Naval Register in the late 1950s. There were proposals to preserve her as a museum, but they fell through. The Navy needed steel, and sentiment was not enough to save her. In 1961, she was sold for scrap. The great hull that had once stood unshaken under enemy fire was cut apart, piece by piece, until nothing remained but memories. For those who had served aboard her, it was a painful goodbye. They knew what history often forgot, that it was Washington, not some famous carrier that had saved the fleet off Guadalcanal, that it was her radar and discipline that changed the way navies fought, that she had stood guard through every turning point of the Pacific War. The world remembers names like Iowa, Missouri, Enterprise, ships that basked in the light of victory. But deep down in the pages of naval history, those who study the sea know another name deserves to stand beside them. USS Washington, BB-56, the quiet giant. She never lost a man in battle to enemy fire. She never failed her mission. She never backed down. She was there when the Navy needed her most, and she did her duty until there was no more duty left to do. Some ships become legends, others become stories told in passing. But the Washington is something rarer, a ghost of steel that still echoes in the hearts of sailors who know what true greatness looks like. Because greatness isn't always loud. It doesn't always demand attention or applause. Sometimes it's the ship that holds the line in silence, the one that fights when no one is watching. And when the sea is calm and the night is clear, somewhere in the deep Pacific, the ocean still whispers her name, USS Washington, the most underrated American battleship of World War II. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more incredible World War II stories. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps support the channel.